Hello everyone, welcome to this, our second seminar in our Critical Topics in Governance and Transport seminar series. Good morning, good evening, wherever you happen to be in the world. I'm Louise Reardon, so I co-chair the Special Interest Group on Governance with Greg Marsden. We're delighted, oh hi Greg, as if by magic. We're delighted to have with us today Dr. Crystal Legacy from the University of Melbourne, who's going to be talking around politicising transport futures. The aim of the session, we want it to be as interactive as possible. So Crystal will kick off with a 20 to 25 minute presentation. If you'd like to ask any questions or anything pops into your head as Crystal's talking, if you could write either a question in the Q&A function box as opposed to the chat box, I'll collect all those questions and I can ask them at the end of Crystal's initial kickoff. Or if you want, raise your hand virtually and I'll enable the microphone for you after the initial presentation. So just a reminder, we are going to record the session. So the aim is that we have at the end of the series, and we've got about 15 presentations, I think, over the next few months through to February. We're going to collect those all and have them on our YouTube channel as a resource for people. So just to bear that in mind. So I hope that's okay with everyone. Really excited to have you all with us and really excited to hear Crystal. So over to you, Crystal.
Thanks, Louise, and I hope everyone can hear me fine. Thank you to Louise for the introduction and to Louise and Greg for the invitation to be part of this seminar series. I really do look forward to a discussion after my presentation and really looking forward to your views and insights as well. So I do look forward to a very interactive discussion. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, which is the land that I speak to you from today. And I want to pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge I also want to use this acknowledgement as an important backdrop for my presentation today, which is about transport politics. Here in Melbourne, we plan on lands that have never been ceded. And for me, this provides an important reminder that I conduct my research in a place where the politics of transport lies deep in histories of dispossession of land. And looking forward, the future of transport is itself also deeply contested. And so too are the imagined transport infrastructures supporting these futures. As new transport technologies and mobility platforms promise a future centered around sharing and automation, the infrastructure to support these new futures and who they benefit demands further critical attention. Calls from within transport studies to critically assess the political assemblages influencing policy formulation and planning governance are in part driven by concerns about the depoliticization of transport policy that render invisible the deeply political aspects of transport planning. Deeply political given their expense, as well as their social, material, and ecological impacts. Illustrations abound of planning practices and processes designed to depoliticize these infrastructures and the futures they promise. Given the significant role transport infrastructure plays in shaping cities and regions, there is still little research exploring what is political about future urban transport. Equally, there is still a gap in how we understand how the political is performed in cities and regions where these futures are articulated. Recent calls from Kobeski and Bassins to re-politicize transport studies are casting attention onto this gap in the existing transport studies literature. And it is this call that my paper today seeks to respond to. Existing research on politicization has a long history. In urban studies, the scholarly tradition is grounded in the works examining practices of resistance generated by grassroots-based movements. This history includes the work of Manuel Castells on social movements and Faranak Mirataf on insurgent planning. There's also the foundational work on urban politics led by, of course, Henry Lefebvre and David Harvey. In transport planning, the works of Jason Henderson, Caroline Crockett, and accounts of resistance directed at devastating contemporary freeways here in Australian cities provide important case studies of politicization in transport planning. Building on this foundation more recently, there has been a rise in critical planning theorists, including the works of Elizabeth Van Weymers, Katie McClymont, Graham Horton, Phil McManus, who look to the critical work of post-foundational scholarship, including the work of Chantal Mouffe and Jacques Rancière, whose work helps to expand understandings of urban politics and ground these understandings in the everyday policies, the practices, and processes of planning. Drawing on the provocative work of Chantal Mouffe, she describes politics as, and I'm quoting from Mouffe here, the assemble of practices, discourses, and institutions that seek to establish a certain order, end quote. While the political, on the other hand, is understood as the antagonistic dimension, which is inherent in all human societies, it is a dimension that can never be eradicated, end quote. There is a relational quality between politics and the political that Mouffe explores in her work. She sees this relational quality occurring, for instance, in the interactions and intersections between extra-parliamentary struggles and parliamentary struggles. That is, in working with state actors and non-state actors to generate new political possibilities. Drawing on the post-foundational scholarship of Chantal Mouffe and Jacques Rancière, the past decade has seen a rise in research examining state-based planning as post-political. This scholarship has produced important insights into the modes of governance, participatory practices, and planning policies that support and indeed normalize depoliticization of planning policies, its practices, and its processes. To consider Mouffe, she argues that the political, or rather politicization, manifests as a counter-hegemonic expression, revealed as a challenge against the state, creating a we and them relationship. This binary of we and them is where the struggle becomes one between opposing hegemonic projects, which can never be reconciled rationally, one of them needing to be defeated. Here I am quoting again from Chantal Mouffe's work. Mouffe argues that there is a transformative potential in taking on state hegemony. And taking on this project, politicization is conducted not through a withdrawal from the state, creating a we and them scenario, but rather through the mobilization of a collective will that draws actors inside as well as outside the state to change it. In this article in front of you, former Victorian state government advisor on a mega road project here in Melbourne speaks out against one of the many controversial inner city toll road projects we have. And he's calling on his fellow practitioners to, and I quote, "Join me in revolt and to stop selling out to a dysfunctional system. Our energies as a profession should go instead to sorting out this mess," end quote. In Mouffe's words, she describes this, and again quoting from her work, the call for democracy that is now being voiced in a variety of quarters, which can only produce lasting effects if the activists involved in these movements, instead of implementing a strategy of withdrawal, accept becoming part of a progressive collective will, engaged in a war of position, to radicalize democratic institutions and to establish a new hegemony, end quote. Looking to another post-foundational thinker in this space, Jacques Rancière, he places his attention on inequality as the central variable in determining what is political in struggle. He argues that the folly of our times, the folly of these times, is the wish to use consensus of one hegemonic order to cure the disease of consensus of another. In other words, and as shown in the work of Jenny MacArthur, a single effort of politicization cannot take all that is political in transport planning into account, as actors are limited in what experiences and form of inequality they encounter. Who and what is acting politically, and why and to what end, is a question embraced by Rancière and has been explored in some depth in urban planning theory. Drawing on Mouffe's call to mobilize a collective will and Rancière's cautioning of using consensus to cure the disease of consensus gives us an interesting framework through which to consider politicization and depoliticization. So in the interstitial spaces between depoliticization and politicization lies the coming together of different actor groups. When this coming together or meeting forges some kind of urban coalition, they have the potential to extend across and build a bridge between the parliamentary and extra-parliamentary actors. These extensions and bridges create the spaces for that which has been previously uncounted to be counted. When these coalitions exist, they may both challenge the formal spaces of planning and shape new informal spaces where political possibilities might take form. If government has tendencies to depoliticize the planning of future transport and look to consensus processes to make that possible, the politicization of transport can be understood as challenges and critiques that can render visible who loses and what is not counted in the production of the city through transport infrastructure provision. Interrogating the spaces where depoliticization meets politicization can help to reveal the political components of a given urban transport imaginary. To this end, this paper explores the possibility of these openings in a single in-depth case study, which I'll now turn to. In the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, the GTHA, an ambitious $50 billion transport plan called the Big Move, transforming transportation in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, signaled a fundamental move by the province of Ontario towards regionalization. This shift, occurring in the wake of the global financial crisis, was an effort by the province of Ontario to consolidate the wider economic imperative through a spatial coordination of regional transit planning, with a focus on several key growth areas. One of those key growth areas was the city of Hamilton, which is a medium-sized, car-dependent city with a population of over 500,000 people. This city would become the recipient of its first light rail project to form as the backbone to a network of buses called the Blast Network. The city of Hamilton is currently in the middle of an urban renaissance. This post-industrial city has been transforming slowly over several decades. New startups, medical innovation, and educational precincts have been met with the arrival of people from Toronto, attracted to Hamilton's comparatively more affordable housing market. In responding to those changes, a backlash in the form of violence targeting select downtown streets has raised concerns. One of those concerns is that the once affordable Hamilton downtown will no longer be so, resulting in displacement of vulnerable populations. The prospect of rapid transit, well welcomed by many for its promise of complete streets, improved pedestrian access, economic development, and providing balanced transport, also raised anxieties for some about the future of their city. At the center of this tension laid a proposed light rail line. This LRT, as Hamiltonians describe it, became a symbol of two competing imaginaries. One centered around an anxiety about the future that led to questions directed about the efficacy of LRT. The other shaped by a sense of hope and optimistic anticipations of what could be for this already transforming city. For the city of Hamilton, the question of future transport was brought to the fore with the promised investment of light rail that would travel along and through its otherwise car-dependent downtown. This proposal would lay bare a tension between two dominant consensuses, one being a desired transition towards sustainable transport forms. In this case, that desired transport form was light rail, and it was supported in local transport documents such as Rapid Ready, and affirmed at key council debates and votes over many years, and it had achieved relative wide-scale public support. After one of those key council votes, a piece was written into the public blog called Raise the Hammer, which projected the image of wide-scale public support for the otherwise somewhat still controversial proposed light rail project. And I'll quote directly from this article. We need to acknowledge the literally hundreds of businesses, community organizations, and anchor institutions that had the vision and courage to publicly affirm their support for this plan and to throw their weight behind it. It takes a lot for businesses or institutions to take a public stand on a political issue. Movements do not just happen by themselves, and an inspiring coalition of volunteers came together over the past several months and years to coordinate LRT activism and advocacy. More broadly, we must applaud the thousands, even tens of thousands of Hamiltonians who have taken the time to learn about that project. Many people who started out skeptical or opposed came to support the plan once they learned more about it, end quote. There was an effort to project an image of consensus in support of this project and in support of a wider image where the future of Hamilton is anchored by new mobility forms for that city. Here, transit and light rail in particular was pivotal. On the other hand, there was another alternative yet equally dominant consensus grounded in ideas of automobile dependence. This consensus could be observed in the suburbanization process, supported by the construction of orbital freeways in recent decades that would go a considerable way to support the expansion of suburbanization and of car-based mobility. This was also supported by urban design efforts that would create one-way streets that directed car-based mobility through the downtown. The debate surrounding Hamilton's future, which light rail formed an important platform, became a contest of two transport imaginaries. Weighing actively into the construction of the transit imaginary was the Hamilton anchor institution leadership that formed what Mouffe might describe as a collective will of parliamentary and extra-parliamentary actors. This loose coalition comprised of long-standing, self-declared, city-shaping business actors such as the Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, as well as the health and educational actors, and their position was to see that LRT be built for the city of Hamilton. Despite their broad interest in city building generally, their leadership became acutely focused on the question of transit. This focus strengthened when in May 2015, the province of Ontario announced that it would provide 100% funding to build a $1 billion light rail line along Hamilton's Main Street, attached to a wider strategy to build a regional network of transit connecting Hamilton to the GTA. The proposed light rail would connect to existing regional services into the center of Toronto, providing local economic benefits along its corridor. The announcement preceded a decade of discussion about regional transit as evidenced in the Big Move plan and about a transition to rapid transit at the local scale, as observed with the release of the City of Hamilton's Rapid Ready plan. These two plans would align and articulate what could be seen by some as a consensus on transit. That as Hamilton grows, it will need a form of transit that can support that growth. In generating continued support for light rail, leadership was coalescing around a shared economic ambition for the city, leveraged by this new transport technology. As one local business representative and resident of Hamilton shared with me in an interview, and I'll quote, "To me, the reason for LRT is what type of city do we want to be? It's about putting ambition back into the ambitious city. It's about thinking about what type of city my kids are going to inherit. I'm also looking at what type of city are they going to ultimately come of age in. If built, light rail would result in the end of one-way streets serving the car, incentivizing business, commercial, and residential investment in Hamilton's downtown, helping to transform it into a more vibrant, pedestrian-friendly, and even becoming a global city, as reflected in the following quote. I think there's a lot of people who see that there's a different way forward, much aligned with what you see in cities around the world, advocating for reinvestment in the downtown, walkable streets, pedestrian-friendly neighborhoods, robust public transport, cycling lanes, all of these things. I think there's a sense that this project would represent a very firm step towards a different type of future for this city. The elitism of this group, the access to resources, the power it had, and indeed the arrogance to defend the light rail publicly could perhaps be forgiven in the manner through which their case was expressed and performed. They engaged in public debate. They showed up at rallies and they worked with local businesses to craft a plan to support them during the hardest phases throughout the construction period. The dissenters equally dug their heels in. One of the more intriguing lines of friction was the perception that light rail was an antiquated form of transit infrastructure, linking it to 20th century infrastructure such as the streetcar, It was described by one interviewee in opposition as a 130-year-old technology that will cause more pollution. Instead, for this interviewee, the future was Google, Siemens, BRT bus, Tesla, we want electric, we want autonomous, solar powered, emissions free. That is the future. It's not rail in the ground. They're now talking about flying cars. That is way in the future, but it's just basically to tell you that that future is progressive. The LRT is regressive, end quote. But not to be sidelined by the promise of future technologies and this idea that one day they might be rolled out, this interviewee was peddling a future transit system with a strong connection to a known transport imaginary centered around ongoing car-based mobility, as seen in the work of Jason Henderson. The framing of this project, grounded in debates about Hamilton's future, put the stakes for this project very high for Hamilton City Councillors and the active citizens. At the time of this presentation, the Hamilton story remains ongoing. The light rail project, despite nearly 12 years of debate, council votes, changes in political leadership, and community discussion, the proposed light rail line project in Hamilton was cancelled in late 2019. A decision taken by the provincial government, igniting another dramatic turn for the politics of transport planning in Hamilton. As the efforts by elected officials, businesses, community to bring LRT to Hamilton will likely continue despite the cancellation in 2019. The call for LRT will likely look increasingly to economic logic in cities as Ontario looks to transport infrastructure to form part of a strategy to recover from the negative economic impacts from COVID-19. But given the ongoing politicization of this project, one can be hopeful that wider questions about housing affordability along the project's corridor, for instance, and supporting Hamilton's vulnerable populations will continue to be part of this discussion, especially in this COVID climate. Returning to the Hamilton anchor institutions, this loose coalition was elite, and it was led by members with deep connections into the existing apparatus of power. But rather than seek to depoliticize the question of light rail transit for the city of Hamilton, which they could have done, actions were taken to illuminate what is at stake for Hamiltonians. What is at stake is Hamilton's mobility future, as well as its economic future. They raised questions about who will benefit, residents of downtown and suburban neighborhoods. What are the costs associated with those futures? A really important social cost, of course, is the displacement of vulnerable communities living in the downtown. And another important question that was raised throughout this was, how were they going to pay for this? How are they going to pay for this? Would it be public versus private ownership once it's built? Well, the efforts of this coalition went some way at exposing what is political about proposed transport futures. The findings align with the work of Jenny MacArthur. MacArthur argues the limits of such elite coalitions to critically engage with the much broader, much wider social, cultural, and historical exclusions connected to race, gender, and class that Mimi Scheller raises in her works, but which can be perpetuated through transport planning. For the city of Hamilton, the exclusion was best observed in debates about housing and affordability, and the concern of closure of small businesses during construction, as it was in acts of politicization where these issues were raised. The politicization of transport in Hamilton was grounded in the politics about what Hamilton was, an industrial city, who it served, current and future generations, car-dependent suburbs, aspirational inner-city residents, vulnerable communities, and business interests. And what Hamilton is currently now, a car-dependent city, and what it could become, a city structured around rapid forms of mobility. By studying these interstitial spaces where some of the efforts by urban coalitions take place, the insights can contribute to debates in urban planning about how state-based politics is critiqued through acts of politicization or reinforced through acts of depoliticization. The case of light rail in Hamilton reveals the allure of consensus to help generate support for an alternative logic, such as sustainable transport. But as research by Elizabeth van Wijmeers shows, the contestation generated from those voices that sit outside this logic, including voices supporting automobility, for instance, also need to be counted. By counting these voices, it is possible to develop a more robust and fair rearticulation of transit that is grounded in the local histories, struggles, anxieties, and hopes experienced by its citizens. To conclude, this paper aimed to engage with a gap in existing literature by examining the role of urban coalitions as they engage in the interstitial spaces between depoliticization and acts of politicization. The paper also engaged with post-foundational thinking generated through the work of Chantal Mouffe and Jacques Rancière to consider the relational aspects of the hegemony of depoliticization and the counter-hegemonic potential of politicization. For transport studies, post-foundational critical thought presents an opportunity to engage the particularities of what is political in the planning for future transport. Post-foundational scholarship provides a useful analytical lens to think about the relationship conflict has with consensus in contemporary transport policies, its practices, and its processes. The work by Rancière in particular presents a potentially important theoretical platform to engage with the issue of consensus as a lens through which to critique efforts of politicization. Such critiques may allow us to ask, when moments of conflict arise, what is at stake in that politicization? For whom is it at stake? And why does this matter to them? And why should it matter to us? What this case helps to illustrate, I hope, is that politicization presents an important moment and opportunity of critique with the potential to open new spaces to engage something or someone that has not been previously counted to be counted. More research is needed to explore how urban actors such as coalitions create spaces for the deeply political aspects of transport planning to be known. We need research that generates insights into what role coalition formation plays in grounding the different ways of knowing the problem of transport in the policies and practices and processes of transport planning. With the future of transport and mobility unknown in this period of considerable technological disruption, an epidemiological, social, spatial, economic, and ecological crisis, the question of the political will remain critical to transport studies and theory. Engaging with what is political about the planning for future transport will go some way to support us, researchers, teachers, practitioners, and community members in the knowing of contemporary struggles for transport and mobility as they are experienced differently in the complex cities and regions we plan and do research in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Crystal, for that really thought-provoking talk. Fascinating, lots to unpick there. Does anyone have any questions? I've enabled everyone's microphones, so if anyone wants to take the mic, my Zoom is currently buffering, so if anyone has put their hand up, I can't see it. Anyone want to kick off with a question? Anyone want to raise their hand and ask Crystal a question?
I see some wonderful people named in this forum, and I'm wondering if I can ask them a question.
Go for it. No. Sophie's actually put her hand up. Right, Sophie.
Hi, Crystal. Great presentation. Very interesting. My thinking around this tends towards the question of where do you get left if you in the resolution of the politicization? I mean, I get that people and I get that raising the dialogue and increasing the tension, you know, increasing the interaction and opening the dialogue is great, right? But in the end, you build something. Or if you don't build something, what you get is more of the same. So, you know, how do you get anywhere with that? I mean, is it just an act of faith that in the end we'll listen to everybody to the point where we can decide what to do? Or is it, I mean, because what you're pointing to is actually more like that we talk and talk and talk and then do nothing, which leaves us with whatever the, you know, people building buildings and shit like that do, right? I mean, you don't get anything different than small roads and maybe some freeways if you do that.
Yeah. Thanks, Sophie, for the question. Sophie's a good friend of mine, and we constantly debating these issues. And I think, Sophie, you raised just an awesome point. I mean, I'm thinking about that a lot in the context of my work, and with the Hamilton case study. And Sophie would know this, and many others on this call who live in Melbourne would know that what I wanted to do in this presentation, but just didn't have the time, was to juxtaposition Hamilton against what's happening in Melbourne, Australia, where there's not a whole lot of debate happening around the efficacy of a project. The debate tends to focus in on, you know, design and sort of aesthetics around the project once it's already been foreclosed, whether or not it's going to be implemented. I think in the case of Hamilton, what I was compelled by was this was a city that wasn't just building another form of, like, just another line of LRT or another freeway or something else that more of the same. It was doing something that was going to shift it fundamentally. And that's not an easy thing to do, to shift fundamentally. And we know that there are plenty of medium-sized cities that are post-industrial that have used light rail to, you know, generate some kind of economic activity in the downtown, and it's fallen flat. So,
yeah.
and what I found really impressive by the community groups that I was following while I was there was that they knew that. and they were passionate about their city. They're passionate about their history as well, which was something to really be celebrated. The geography of the city is very complicated because it has an escarpment. There's an upper and a lower, so there's all these really interesting divisions. But as a city, they were working through that question of who are we? Who are we? What are we about? And where do we want to go? Which is a different kind of conversation to a big city like Toronto or Melbourne or London, who have a pretty good sense of who they are, and infrastructure plays into that, but it's not a fundamental transition. In this city, it was a fundamental transition. I think that was my read of it. Others may have a different read if people are close to that case study as well. But thank you, Sophie.
Great, thanks.
I have a question from Jen MacArthur. Hi, Crystal, thanks for the very interesting presentation. I was wondering if you could talk more about tactics used by coalitions and how they learn and adapt their strategies over time.
Yeah. Well, in the case of Hamilton, you know, there were really two dominant forces, and they both had some level of dominance in council as well. So council was split, and it took years and years and years to kind of get to a point where council finally agreed that let's pursue light rail, until the province came in and just squashed it. But the tactics they used were, there was a lot of populism at play, a lot of the sort of the fake news stuff that was happening, a lot of dismissing of technical reports that have been conducted by planners and by academics, and rereading it and repackaging it to serve other purposes. So there was a bit of that was happening. So the McMaster University, the transport studies group there, got involved in a bit of that tussle and had to kind of reaffirm what their studies were saying about light rail and its efficacy for a city like Hamilton. They got political. They ran, the dissenters ran politicians and local council. They developed relationships with members of parliament at the provincial level. So they understood that this was a very political beast, this light rail project. And they were quite active in trying to squash any kind of consensus around light rail being part of the sustainable transport future. They also looked to buses as being something that the city ought to consider and invest in instead. So in terms of strategies, particularly, there was just a lot of sort of framing and reframing. There was public blogs that were very active in trying to reframe those debates. And I guess the last thing that's worth saying in terms of sort of the Hamilton anchor institution that I spoke to, often I juxtapose my research in Canada with what I'm doing here in Australia, but they got dirty, you know, I mean, dirty not in the dirty politics sense, but in, you know, they got involved, you know, they showed up at public debates. They were part of those debates. You know, these leaders, you know, these actors, these, you know, CEOs of companies participating in debates about the future of a city, which certainly in the Melbourne context where I come from, that doesn't happen all that often. So I was very compelled by that. So they engaged in the debate, which I thought was pretty but they were late as well, which, you know, Jenny, I referenced your work, the work that you did in Auckland, which I found really resonated for me in thinking about what was happening in Hamilton, that they got some of the issues right, but they weren't able to capture everything because of their elite position in society there.
Thank you, Crystal. So I have a question. Greg Marsden has a question.
Hi, Crystal. Thanks for that presentation. Really enjoyed it. My question's about the bit you didn't really say so much about, which was the decision to cancel the scheme, which came from the layer of government above. So what's the kind of multi-level angle on this? What was the politics that was going on at the provincial level, and how did that relate to what happened on the ground, and what do you think the implications of that are for thinking about politicisation of schemes at a local level when things are often not, well, they're rarely ever just local?
Yeah, thank you, Greg, for that question. What's interesting is that my research on Hamilton concluded probably a year before that announcement finally, because it seemed like a done deal by the time I was finished my research there. And the province came in and just, you know, pulled the rug from under their feet. And my understanding and my read of it was a conservative government in Ontario and a sort of a Labour Liberal government at more or socially democratic government at a more local level. So there was a bit of a split in terms of political allegiance, and I think it was leveraged. But it was the cost blowout of the project that eventually led the provincial government to pull the rug, which doesn't make any sense because, of course, there's always sunk costs, right? There were a lot of investment that had already gone into that project. So it was a bit fuzzy, even the way in which the announcement was made. The mayor of Hamilton was sidelined. And that announcement happened in December, I believe it was November, December of last year. So I'm not fully aware of what exactly happened there, but I do know that light rail as a conversation is still live, and that in part is because they're looking for shovel-ready infrastructure, and that project is very much shovel-ready in terms of as it relates to the COVID climate we find ourselves in.
Thanks, Crystal. I have a question from Maria Attard. Maria?
Hi all. Thank you, Crystal, for the presentation. I'm not sure whether you managed to, whilst looking at the LRT project, to sort of get a broader view of the politics and the policies, because the question is whether there were different speeds at which decisions were taken in respect to LRT, say versus road building. So you said that the project took 12 years of discussion. Is that the speed at which road construction projects take to be decided upon? And so this, I think the speed of discussion here, of course, the element here is the politicization. And so does politicization act as a delaying tactic for sustainable mobility? Question.
Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry, Maria.
No, that's the question. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so the speed of infrastructure delivery. I think the first thing to mention is the big move, which was the provincial plan that was released in 2008. Had aspirational projects, but they weren't funded projects. The Hamilton project became a funded project in 2015. But a lot of the technical work to kind of support that and getting it over the line had been conducted during that interim period. But in terms of the question, so it took a little while because Ontario and Toronto is a very complex region with a lot of transport asks being put forward to the province. But in terms of the speed of construction around LRT versus roads, there were orbital roads built around Hamilton, and they were equally controversial and cancelled and then back on the table as different governments, leadership and visions shifted and changed. So it doesn't seem like LRT is suffering any more or less to road construction, but I reckon the shift in sort of mentality towards sustainable transport for Hamilton is a more recent shift. Now, I am hesitant to commit to that as a statement because I do know that Hamilton was given the opportunity to build SkyRail. If anyone here has been to Vancouver, you'll be familiar with their SkyRail system. And that technology was proposed for Hamilton before it was proposed for Vancouver. So it's had a very long history and conversation around forms of light rail transit. And of course, Hamilton, like many cities around the world, had streetcars at one point in time. And those streetcars were ripped out during the time when that shift towards automobility happened in North American cities.
Thank you. I've got a question from Kate Pangborn. Kate, forgive me if I don't do justice to this as I read it. It says, thank you, Crystal, for a very interesting talk. I learned about a whole new area of literature, applying concepts new to me. I have a similar concern to Sophie about how we decide and provide when it isn't possible to satisfy every voice. I was struck by the quote you had from your data about how the progressive future was solar powered and autonomous, but far in the future. This jam tomorrow idea is a frequent phenomenon used equally, it seems, by those in power and those outside the dominant power structures. But it tends to lead to no decision making, inaction and incrementalism that solves nothing but results in a greater need for a big solution and generates vulnerability to being captured by powerful private interests who ride in with a shiny technological solution that they profit from, but which is not informed by the wealth of expertise that we have about transport and mobility and its social and distributional impacts. For example, what would Uber Air mean for Melbourne? Is it even possible?
Oh, I hope it doesn't happen. Sorry, did I say that out loud? Look, thank you, Kate, for that question. There's a lot in there, and my initial reaction to it was to, my interest in post-foundational thinkers and my kind of love affair, so to speak, with sort of the post-political and thinking about politicization is in part to recognize that often the way we do transport planning or planning generally closes us off to things that we don't typically consider because it just isn't part of the model, isn't part of the land use plan, isn't part of the paradigm upon which we plan with or through. So the idea of politicization is not just to have everyone's voices heard, which I think Sophie kind of signaled earlier. It's to make sure what is not counted is counted, which is a very different thing. It's not just having everyone's voice and we talk and over and over and over. It is to make sure that we make sure that those voices that are marginalized because there's a question of class, or marginalized because there's a question of race, or marginalized because there's a question of socioeconomic privilege, are given the opportunity, not even given the opportunity, they seek out that opportunity impart themselves with others, and we as planners, we hear it, we see it for what it is, that it's not just a bunch of NIMBYs or a bunch of people who are just trying to stop the project, but there is something in there that perhaps we should pause and consider. So that's really where I'm standing with this question of politicization, and why I'm playing with it as an analytical and theoretical framework and thinking about transport planning, is because I want to open up the discussion around politics so that it's beyond just the institutions, the institutional politics, and it's beyond even just thinking about, I don't know, sort of political parties. It is about society trying to figure out where it's going, and the tussle in a very pluralistic, complex set of urban environments and suburban environments and regions that we now find ourselves in.
Thank you, Crystal. I've had a flurry of questions on the chat. So first question from Marion Bias. Does consensus more often lead to progressive projects getting dumped than not? Thinking of the Durban, forgive me if I said that wrong, parking strategy in Melbourne, which was scrapped as a strong local car lobby group became the dominant voice.
So is that, sorry,
so
that's the first part of the question.
Does consensus more often lead to progressive projects getting dumped than not?
Yeah, okay. I can't say definitively. I mean, I'm critiquing consensus. You see, I mean, one of the things that I'm playing with as a binary is this idea that one consensus that is perhaps hegemonic car dependency can be replaced by another consensus, sustainable transport. And that somehow makes things a little bit better and okay, and perhaps it does. But still a consensus closes off things that aren't counted within that consensus. So that's the politicization. It's about the constant tussle. There should never, I shouldn't say there should never be, but perhaps settling in on a consensus and being comfortable with it is perhaps what can possibly get us in a little bit of trouble, because every consensus, of course, has to be defended. But with the Durban, so I mean, that's a very local question, Marion. I know Marion from the work I do here, and a lot of the community-based work that I do with Marion, and there are some examples where a consensus is generated that is quite regressive when the council themselves was quite progressive. And in the context of engaging communities, a project, a plan like that is actually probably, in my view, the wrong outcome occurred, and that was a regressive form of parking policy. There's always that risk, and you know, there's no one size fits all, but you know, it's that particular council is still trying to work out what its future is, and it lost that battle, but it may not have lost the war, so to speak.
Thank you. I have another question here from Nathan Pittman. Hi, Crystal. As you're definitely aware, much of the transit investment discussion in nearby Toronto is framed through a geographic equity lens. I'm thinking along the lines of the Scarborough deserves a subway rhetoric. Do you observe that sort of argument being deployed in Hamilton?
Absolutely, yeah. So very much suburban versus the urban residents. Suburban did not want, I can't paint them all in the same brush, but the framing around what suburban residents wanted was that $1 billion from the province to be to support the maintenance of capital work, so just sewers and pipes and all that sort of stuff, or the expansion of a bus network that no one ever took because it was competing on roadways and traffic, and the urban, who, you know, the urban residents shifting in terms of the demographic, becoming certainly more gentrified as the gentrifiers moving into Hamilton. So these new Hamiltonians that didn't know or understand and perhaps respect the history of Hamilton in the way that long-standing Hamiltonians did. It was a city, I know Hamilton very well. My father worked in one of the factories there that ended up closing down. It's a very post-industrial city. There's a lot of trauma in that city. There's a lot of, hard lived experiences. And I can understand why a city like Hamilton is taking some time to work through the clash of histories and future aspirations, but also the change in demographics and change of aspiring residents coming in from a very different urban experience, perhaps from Toronto, but certainly from elsewhere as well.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions from Tsomu about the cancellation of the light rail. So you mentioned about the economic issue. Do you think that was the most important factor in the cancellation? And going on to say, in my area in Japan, We have LRT program for years, but it doesn't end up happening because it took a long time for discussion and planning, and then the government financial support was gone. So it seems like the economic issue is the most critical and essential thing.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, because as I said earlier, it fell outside of the scope of the intensive research I did in Hamilton. So the latest sort of drama around the light rail project is something that I'm not fully aware of the intricacies, because I haven't gone back to do interviews. I'm just going based on media analysis. And I believe, given the government that's in power now at the province of Ontario, it wouldn't surprise me if there were some sort of cynical politics at play, and the economics of light rail was used as a facade, as a front-facing logic to rationalize the cancellation. But I'm not sure. I'm not certain, because I haven't gone back to do the field work.
Thank you. Is there any final question, comment, reflection from the floor? Okay, it seems not. Can I, I have a, Sophie.
Sorry, it takes me a moment to think through what I'm trying to say, because this is not my familiar territory. I mean, I think this question that you're asking about replacing one consensus with another, you know, I think it's great. And I guess looking into some other things that I've been thinking about a lot, which actually come out of a novel that I read with my parents, which people might be interested in. It's called The Overstory. I don't know if you've read it, by Richard Powers. It's a beautiful book about trees. And I have been left with this question of rethinking, what does a sustainable future look like? And, you know, coming back in this circle to ultimately we would need to be doing a lot less about everything, really, if we were trying to be sustainable. You know, like, I know a lot of people have been struggling with this COVID thing about, you know, who am I if I can't go to work and go out and party every other night? And, you know, can I stand being this quiet being that sits in a house and doesn't have much of an effect on anything? But, you know, if you sort of think it through, actually, we kind of probably need to go there if we're going to have a society that doesn't destroy the planet and still has 6 billion or 9 billion or 12 billion people in it. So I've been thinking about that, and I can see that this, in some senses, this idea that we need a consensus to carry us somewhere, and even the concept of progressive, is really seriously problematic inside of a dialogue that's about slowing down, doing less, making life about something more, you know, and maybe there's some really interesting or opportunities inside of this idea about politicizing things, not to make everything more angry and rah-rah and aggressive, but to make it more thoughtful and more compassionate and more and slower and less about progress, you know, in a sense.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm left with.
Crystal.
And for that, I thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Crystal, can I pause you and be really frustrating? Because in the interest of time, I've got a couple of other people that want to jump in. Is that okay? And then I'll give you the floor. Yeah. Laura Aston, you had a question.
Yes, thanks, Louise. Thanks, Crystal. I'm just wondering if you can help clarify my understanding on the role of coalitions. When you say more research is needed on their role in shaping transport policy, are you also talking about coalitions within government, not just the extra governmental advocacy groups and organisations you mentioned in your presentation?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I mean, there's been plenty of research on oh goodness, my mind's just gonna lose. I'm just remembering the work of my colleague John Stone, who's looked at actor groups and how they have formed to shift the paradigm in government. And also the research of Nick Lowe and Carrie Curtis talking about sort of institutional path dependencies and how the work that's required to make shifts at an institutional level. I guess why I'm interested in the parliamentary and extra-parliamentary, because my work starts from the community. So that's where I see the world from, is state is somehow not meeting the needs of communities in a variety of different ways. And I tend to see that through a social justice lens, a social spatial justice lens. So the work of the parliamentary and extra-parliamentary, the bringing them together, has in part been inspired by some of the really interesting stuff that's happening here in Melbourne, where people who have once worked for government are stepping away, but still using their connections with government to help mobilize or help shape the conversation or help work with community groups in terms of how they understand the problem of transport. Certainly in Hamilton, the coalition was incredibly elite. They had long-standing sort of connections. They weren't necessarily in government, but like their power was such that they certainly had ways of framing and achieving policy. So I guess I'm interested in what happens when there's work happening in that interstitial spaces. There's not just the them versus us, the othering thing that tends to happen. There's been a lot of counter-hegemonic sort of protest against big inner city freeways that I've been following here in Melbourne, and that has served to some good ends in terms of stopping some projects, but they haven't quite shifted haven't quite won the war on that one. So I'm interested in how do we win that war. So again, that extra parliamentary and parliamentary means we need to do some work with the actors within the state.
Thank you, Crystal. And did you have any reflections on Sophie's point before I cut you off about slowness and kind of this need for more a sort of calming politicization almost?
Look, I mean, calming politicization. Again, as I said earlier, I'm very critical of consensus, but I'm equally losing patience for constant sort of tussle as well, right? You know, we have some real issues that we need to address. Like and I think we can all recognize that. So the politicization that I'm talking about is not conversation for the sake of ongoing conversation to nauseam, but rather to pick up that stuff that doesn't sit inside the usual formal spaces of transport planning. So for instance, the impact on Indigenous people. Where does that sit in our conversation about transport planning? And here in Melbourne, where I sit on contested land that has never been ceded, not part of the conversation. It's still very fringe. So I'm interested in what happens when that becomes part of the conversation, when what is uncounted becomes counted.
Great, thank you, Crystal. So unfortunately, our time is up. Thank you, Crystal, for a really thought-provoking talk. Thank you all for your excellent contributions and discussion, and hopefully we can take it forward in further forums as we go along. Just an advert while I have you as a captive audience for our next seminar, which is on Tuesday the 15th of September, 4 p.m. British Summer Time. We've got Dr. David Weinrich on organising transit institutions to facilitate cross-jurisdictional service integration, a comparative case study. So keep an eye on our website for the link and the registration for that. So thank you, Crystal. Virtual round of applause from everyone for a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.